Welcome to part 2 of a topic analysis on culture and worldview development. This is Ben Powell, and we have just finished talking about 3 different theories of child development and how they interface with culture and worldview development. And now we're going to turn our attention to how these theories of development, which have become theories of worldview and culture development, influence children, influence programs, and influence teachers. And first of all, let's look at programs. So CWD and quality of early childhood programs. First of all, let's look at the cognitive structural theory and its faith counterpart. Positives. Programs that adopt this perspective are able to assess and track some of CWD by interfacing Piaget and Fowler. Programs can increase their influence by focusing on cognitive content. Specifically in religious early childhood programs, they can really ramp up their influence by focusing on cognitive content. Negatives. Programs following this theory may only present one worldview, or they may present a false neutrality. They may think that what they're presenting is neutral, when in reality it is a worldview. It may not be a formalized faith, but they may be presenting children and infants and toddlers with an understanding of the world that it in itself is not neutral. Secondly, the socio-emotional and its attachment theory counterpart. Positives. Programs along these lines can provide quality basis for most cultures and worldviews by establishing relationships of trust. Negative. Programs following the attachment theory may influence a child in his or her worldview if parents are abusive and neglective, and the parents may be further upset by this. Secondly, programs may downplay non-relational views of God. Pantheism and atheism would struggle in this environment. Third, psychosocial development and its religious styles perspective. Positive. Programs with this perspective can integrate relationships and experiences for culture and worldview development. Programs can account for the tension that sometimes exists between parents and their children, and this may not be very visible in early childhood education, but it may be, and especially for third culture children of immigrants and refugees, this is happening from a very young age. Negative. Programs along these lines may downplay the child culture and worldview development as elementary, depending on which style he or she is in, and which style he or she progresses toward. And it may teach God as parent negatively, whereas the attachment theory would see it as a positive thing. Secondly, child learning outcomes interfaced with these development theories. Again, to cognitive and structural. Positives. Children will be guided through primal and intuitive projective faith. Children will be strong in culture and worldview content and cognition. So they'll know a lot about the worldview that's being presented, and also receive a lot of help in processing and understanding it from a mental perspective. Negatives. Children may not have the relational support needed to develop culturally and to develop their worldview, as this is not a point of emphasis. And children may not be allowed to deviate from family or society. The faith development theory sees it as a very much concrete and progressive and linear process. So it's hard to understand when children deviate. Socio-emotional positives. Children will develop the worldview of those that they trust the most under this attachment theory perspective. And children will likely experience good social interaction as a precursor for future worldview development, and specifically in the child's relationship with the divine. Negatives. Children may attach too much to educators if parents are not present, which could have negative effect when children change classes or providers or educators. And finally, the psychosocial and its religious styles counterpart, positive. Children will be guided through subjective and instrumental reciprocal styles in early childhood education, and children will have their experiences and relationships valued by their educators. Negatives. Children may be encouraged to place their own experiences and understandings above any collective understanding of culture and worldview. This psychosocial perspective really emphasizes the individual and de-emphasizes the institutional and, in some regard, the collective. Finally, tips for educators based on these developmental theories and their culture and worldview counterparts. So, the cognitive structure faith development theory would suggest that educators introduce children to multiple worldview perspectives as age is appropriate. It would suggest that educators understand how children may process worldview questions. It would advise educators to work with parents to discern where a child or student is at in his or her worldview development. Again, looking at it from a more linear and concrete perspective. And this theory would have educators match educational methods to students as they become ready for the next stage of culture and worldview development, and help parents do this also. Really, really good stuff in terms of helping educators and parents do engage their children with the next step. Socio-emotional and attachment theory would suggest that educators communicate the importance of healthy attachment for culture and worldview development and for future emotional health. It would suggest that educators understand how children's conceptions of God will be influenced by relations with parents and caregivers. It advises that teachers respond to children's needs in a timely and caring fashion. And finally, it encourages them to develop trust between them and children to establish their IWM. Psychosocial and religious styles perspective would encourage teachers to encourage children to move beyond egocentrism and recognize the needs of others, something that all children need. It would have teachers understand children's experiences, community, and relationships all have a role in shaping culture and worldview. It would put forward that teachers determine personal and program culture and worldview in order to know how they will influence children. This is important. So metacognition, in order to understand that you as an educator or caretaker will be one who has a great influence. And finally, it encourages educators to relate to parents as their child's culture and worldview may develop differently than their own based on unique experiences that the child has, and a difference in community that the child has as compared to what the parent had. So I want to close by presenting two scenarios, and this is a way to wrap up what we have discussed. We have gone from describing what is culture and what is worldview to thinking about their importance in the development of every human being, to understanding their role in the early childhood classroom, and then finally looking at culture and worldview development through child development theory, which then allowed us to make some practical applications to children, to programs, and to teachers. So with those things in mind, let's process these scenarios and see how culture and worldview development may be important to our work as educators. So I'm going to put this scenario up. And I'm going to ask that you read it and think for yourself, that last line there. How does your understanding of different theories of worldview development help you extend the children's learning in this moment? So think about how you understand worldview development, perhaps through the lens of one of the theories that we mentioned, and how you can use that understanding in this moment to further a child's learning and further a child's worldview development. Here's a second scenario for you, and I'm going to have you read it on your own again. This is another example of something that may happen in your class or at your program that demands that you understand yourself, that you understand worldview development in general, and that you process it through a theory of child development, and that you use the intersection of all of those areas of knowledge to come up with a practical solution for this 1.5-year-old who all of a sudden loses her routine due to a family's religious convictions. So once again, how does your understanding of worldview development inform your ongoing educational efforts for this child as well as family support? Think through this, and I hope that this lecture has been informative. It's been a blessing to do research in this area, and I have enjoyed looking into an area that perhaps isn't as prevalent in other early childhood education texts. And so I hope that this is important for you and that you've benefited from it. And lastly, here you can look at the reference page if you want to know more about the certain theories of development that were briefly touched on. You can look at Scarlett and Streeb there. And if you want to find a more practical example of how this impacts things, you can look at Cotterman and Barnes as well. So thank you again, and thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.